In the wine-dark waters between three continents lies an island that has never truly bowed. For 4 millennia, Crete has stood as both prize and fortress, coveted by empires yet unconquered in spirit. Here, Europe's first maritime civilization raised palaces where bulls danced with mortals in sacred rituals. Here, Venetian merchants built walls that would withstand the longest siege in history. Here, Nazi paratroopers met their match against farmers, wielding ancient courage and modern rifles. From Minoan sea kings to Ottoman sultans, from Byzantine emperors to German generals, every conqueror discovered the same truth. This island could be occupied, but never possessed. Mountains that sheltered resistance fighters, harbors that launched 1,000 rebellions, and a people who chose death before submission. This is the chronicle of a land where freedom was not given, but carved from stone with blood and determination. Bronze arrived in the eastern Mediterranean like a whispered secret, transforming everything it touched. On a mountainous island between Egypt and the Greek mainland, farmers discovered that tools forged from this miraculous alloy could slice through earth with an ease that made their ancestors' stone implements seem like children's toys. The surplus this efficiency created, grain that fed not just families, but entire communities, became the foundation of Europe's first great maritime empire. The island's position made it a natural crossroads for ancient trade. Egyptians sailing north with gold and papyrus met Anatolian merchants carrying silver and precious stones, while ships from the western Mediterranean brought amber and exotic metals from lands beyond the known world. Local communities that had survived for generations through fishing and subsistence farming suddenly found themselves at the center of commercial networks spanning 3 continents. This transformation manifested most dramatically at Knossos, where master builders raised a complex that would cover nearly 6 acres when complete. The palace that emerged from decades of construction challenged every assumption about what human beings could accomplish. Water flowed through bronze pipes to every level of the structure, while waste disappeared through sophisticated drainage systems that would not be matched in Europe for more than 1,000 years. Light wells brought illumination deep into the interior, creating spaces where hundreds of people could work, worship, and govern an empire that stretched across the Mediterranean basin. The frescoes that decorated these walls revealed a civilization unlike anything known from contemporary cultures. Artists painted scenes of startling beauty and complexity. Young athletes vaulting over charging bulls in displays that combined religious devotion with breathtaking physical courage. Women wearing elaborate costumes that demonstrated sophisticated textile production, and marine life rendered with such accuracy that modern marine biologists can identify specific species from artwork created 35 centuries ago. Bull-leaping ceremonies held in the great central courtyard drew crowds that traveled from across the Mediterranean world to witness performances that transformed raw animal power into artistic expression. These rituals, captured in frescoes throughout the palace, showed athletes approaching massive bulls with timing so precise that any miscalculation meant death. As the animals charged, performers grasped their horns and used the creature's own momentum to vault over their backs, in graceful arcs that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Religious practices centered on forces of nature rather than human-shaped deities dwelling in distant realms. The snake goddess, her serpentine companions coiled around her arms, embodied the earth's creative power while protecting households from supernatural threats. Sacred trees, especially those growing in isolated groves, served as focal points for ceremonies that connected human communities to seasonal cycles governing agricultural abundance. Mountain sanctuaries, accessible only through difficult climbs, provided elevated spaces where worshippers experienced direct communion with forces controlling earthquakes, storms, and fertility. Administrative efficiency enabled this cultural flowering through record-keeping systems that coordinated economic activities across vast distances. Palace scribes used a writing system that combined pictographic symbols with phonetic signs, creating detailed inventories of livestock, agricultural production, and manufactured goods. These linear A tablets, though still undeciphered, reveal management capabilities that enabled supervision of complex operations involving thousands of workers and millions of individual items. The storage magazines demonstrated the scope of this economic organization. Enormous jars, some taller than a grown man, lined corridor after corridor in orderly arrangements that held oil, wine, grain, and other commodities in quantities sufficient to supply urban populations for months at a time. This systematic stockpiling protected against harvest failures, while providing resources that enabled long-term planning and ambitious construction projects. Seafaring innovations drove the growth that lifted regional success into international dominance. Shipwrights developed vessel designs optimized for Mediterranean conditions, long, narrow hulls that could be rowed when winds failed, while providing cargo capacity adequate for profitable long-distance commerce. Laden with signature pottery styles, these ships traveled routes that linked distant shores from Spain to the Black Sea, reflecting the vast reach of commercial exchange. The absence of fortifications distinguished these prosperous communities from contemporary cities throughout the ancient world. While other cultures invested enormous resources in defensive walls and military installations, Minoan's settlements remained completely open to the surrounding countryside. This architectural choice reflected confidence that naval supremacy provided adequate protection from any conceivable threat. Fleets controlled sea lanes so effectively that potential enemies could never reach the island's shores, making land-based defenses unnecessary. What artists achieved then went on to inspire and influence Mediterranean culture for hundreds of years. Pottery evolved from simple, functional forms into elaborate vessels decorated with marine motifs. Octopi, dolphins, and fish, rendered with naturalistic precision that captured movement and life. Fresco techniques combined Egyptian precision with observational skills that portrayed human emotion and natural beauty with unprecedented effectiveness. Sculptors working in bronze, gold, and precious stones created objects of extraordinary delicacy that demonstrated technical mastery while expressing spiritual values, emphasizing harmony between human communities and natural forces. The purple dye industry exemplified this commercial sophistication through processes that transformed humble sea creatures into the ancient world's most precious commodity. Murex shells, harvested from coastal waters throughout the Mediterranean, yielded the colorant that became synonymous with royal luxury. A single garment dyed with this substance required thousands of shells gathered from waters across the eastern Mediterranean, making purple cloth worth more than its weight in precious metals. Goldworking reached artistic heights that impressed even craftsmen familiar with Egyptian and Mesopotamian techniques. Artisans created jewelry of extraordinary refinement, earrings shaped like tiny wasps with wings so delicate they trembled at each breath, necklaces strung with beads carved to resemble flowers and marine shells, and ceremonial vessels decorated with repoussé scenes depicting religious processions and mythological narratives. These objects combined technical virtuosity with aesthetic sensitivity that reflected cultural values, emphasizing beauty as highly as practical utility. Through diplomacy, foreign dignitaries were drawn to the palace's grandeur, forging trade agreements that benefited everyone involved. Egyptian tomb paintings depicted Minoan envoys presenting gifts to the pharaoh. Distinctive pottery, metalwork, and textiles that demonstrated their homeland's artistic achievements, while securing continued access to Nile Valley markets. These diplomatic missions established precedents for international cooperation that enabled peaceful resolution of commercial disputes while facilitating cultural exchange. Compared to their counterparts in the ancient world, women in this society enjoyed a notably elevated role. Artistic representations showed females participating equally in religious ceremonies, athletic competitions, and administrative activities that other societies reserved exclusively for men. Elaborate costumes depicted in frescoes suggested that women controlled significant economic resources while enjoying social freedoms that would not be matched elsewhere for many centuries. The prominence of goddess figures in religious iconography reinforced patterns of gender equality that distinguished Minoan culture from male-dominated societies developing elsewhere. Peak sanctuaries scattered across the mountainous interior provided religious centers that served rural populations while maintaining connections to palace-based ceremonial systems. These elevated sites, accessible through difficult climbs that tested pilgrims' devotion, offered spectacular views that inspired religious contemplation, while providing practical advantages for astronomical observation. Votive offerings discovered at these locations demonstrate continued use across many centuries, indicating religious traditions that remained stable despite political and social changes in urban centers. With no landmarks in sight, seafarers turned to refined scientific knowledge to chart their course across open waters. Astronomical observations allowed calculation of seasonal variations affecting wind patterns and current flows, while understanding of celestial mechanics made possible the long-distance voyages that established commercial outposts throughout the Mediterranean basin. This technical expertise enabled regular contact between the island homeland and far-flung trading communities, while maintaining schedules that coordinated agricultural production with commercial demands. The prosperity that sustained this remarkable culture created conditions that would ultimately contribute to its destruction. Success attracted attention from mainland Greek communities, whose populations had grown beyond their territory's capacity to support them. These Mycenaean societies combined military organization, learned from northern invaders, with technological innovations acquired through commercial contact with more advanced Mediterranean cultures. Natural warnings preceded the catastrophe that would end this golden age. The volcanic island, called Thera, visible from northern shores on clear days, had been rumbling ominously for months before the explosion that would reshape the ancient world. Ash clouds turned sunset colors at midday, while sailors reported unusual wave patterns that made navigation treacherous. Palace astronomers struggled to interpret celestial phenomena that their traditional knowledge could not explain, creating unease among populations accustomed to predictable environmental conditions. The eruption that destroyed Thera unleashed forces beyond anything in recorded human experience. The sound carried across hundreds of miles, shattering pottery in palace storage rooms while terrifying populations who had never encountered anything comparable. Ash clouds turned day to night across the eastern Mediterranean, while tsunamis generated by the collapsing volcanic cones swept away coastal settlements that had flourished for generations. For a civilization whose prosperity depended entirely on maritime trade and agricultural abundance, these environmental changes proved catastrophic. Ships could not navigate seas clogged with volcanic debris, while ash-covered fields produced crops inadequate to support urban populations. The carefully balanced economic systems that had sustained palace complexes began collapsing under pressures that no administrative sophistication could overcome. Mycenaean forces, recognizing opportunity created by natural disaster, launched invasions that overwhelmed defenders who had never developed military institutions adequate for resisting organized attack. These mainland warriors used bronze weapons and tactical formations, superior to anything available to populations that had relied on naval protection rather than land-based armies. Their conquest proceeded with brutal efficiency that contrasted starkly with the peaceful character of the culture they destroyed. Palace archives went up in flames that consumed records spanning centuries of commercial transactions, diplomatic correspondence, and administrative procedures. The Linear A script that had documented this prosperity became undecipherable when the last scribes who understood its meaning perished in palace fires or fled to mountain refuges where their knowledge died with them. Frescoes that had celebrated life's beauty darkened under smoke from burning timbers, while bronze pipes melted in conflagrations that marked the end of Europe's first great maritime empire. Linear B replaced Linear A as conquerors imposed their own administrative systems on territories they now controlled. The new script recorded tribute demands and military obligations rather than festival preparations and commercial ventures, reflecting values that emphasized warfare over peaceful prosperity. Mycenaean officials established garrisons in strategic locations, while extracting resources needed to support military activities that had enabled their conquest. The transformation was so complete that later Greeks would remember this advanced culture primarily through myths about labyrinths and monsters, rather than its remarkable achievements in art, commerce, and peaceful governance. Stories of King Minos and the Minotaur preserved distorted echoes of palace complexes and bull-leaping ceremonies, while tales of Daedalus and Icarus transformed sophisticated engineering accomplishments into legends about artificial flight and divine punishment for excessive ambition. In mountain caves where refugees preserved fragments of their heritage, stories began taking shape that would eventually inspire Greek literature while maintaining connections to a vanished world. These narratives, distorted by centuries of oral transmission, captured something essential about the era when gods and mortals shared the same realm, when bulls danced willingly with human partners, and when peace, rather than war, governed relationships between Mediterranean communities. The collapse marked the end of humanity's first experiment in maritime empire, based on commercial exchange rather than military conquest. Yet the influence of its achievements would echo through subsequent cultures that inherited trade networks, artistic traditions, and technological innovations developed during 6 centuries of unprecedented prosperity. The peaceful governance it had maintained remained a tantalizing glimpse of what human societies might accomplish when cooperation replaced competition as the foundation of international relationships. Thus ended the age of the labyrinth, when Crete ruled the seas through wisdom rather than weapons, when beauty mattered as much as power, and when the wine-dark waters carried prosperity rather than conquest to every shore they touched. Smoke still drifted from the ruins of Knossos, 3 generations after Mycenaean warriors had stormed through corridors where sacred bulls once danced with mortal athletes. The conquerors from mainland Greece spoke a harsh language that grated against ears accustomed to the musical sounds of Linear A, while their scribes scratched angular Linear B symbols onto tablets recording tribute demands rather than festival preparations. Bronze spear points enforced submission where cooperation had once flourished. Yet the mountain villages that had supplied the great palace with grain and olive oil continued their ancient rhythms despite foreign overlords. The Mycenaean occupation transformed every aspect of life on the island. Garrison commanders established fortified positions overlooking strategic valleys, their warriors ready to suppress any sign of rebellion among populations that had never known military rule. Administrative procedures that had coordinated voluntary cooperation gave way to bureaucratic systems designed to extract maximum tribute while maintaining control through fear. The sophisticated commercial networks that had carried purple-dyed textiles and golden jewelry to pharaohs and kings withered as military priorities consumed resources once devoted to peaceful trade. Linear B tablets from this period reveal the harsh realities of foreign domination. These records, successfully deciphered unlike their Linear A predecessors, document tribute quotas imposed on communities throughout the island. So many sheep from mountain villages, specified quantities of olive oil from coastal settlements, bronze weapons from workshops that had once created ceremonial vessels. The scribes who carved these symbols served masters who understood conquest, but remained blind to the sophisticated culture they had destroyed. Still, beneath this surface submission, older traditions survived in forms the occupiers could neither comprehend nor completely suppress. Mountain shepherds continued gathering at sacred caves where their ancestors had honored the earth goddess, while coastal fishermen maintained rituals that ensured favorable winds and abundant catches. Women preserved textile techniques that produced fabrics of extraordinary quality, though the purple dyes that had once marked royal garments became impossible to obtain as trade networks collapsed under military pressure. The greater catastrophe arrived from the western seas around 1200 BC, when raiders bearing no familiar markings appeared off northern shores. These sea peoples, driven from distant homelands by famines and invasions that had devastated the eastern Mediterranean world, carried destruction wherever their fleets touched land. Their iron weapons cut through bronze armor like farmers' scythes through grain, while their ships moved with speed and maneuverability that overwhelmed defenders still fighting according to Bronze Age tactics. Mycenaean strongholds that had dominated the island for 2 centuries crumbled within months, as garrison commanders abandoned territories they could no longer defend. The last Linear B tablets record desperate attempts to organize resistance, followed by silence as administrative centers fell to enemies who left only ash and broken stones. Refugees fleeing the destruction carried tales of warriors who fought like demons, while their iron blades shattered every bronze weapon raised against them. The collapse of Mycenaean authority left communities to survive through whatever local resources they could muster. Villages that had depended on palace redistribution systems suddenly faced starvation, as storage magazines lay empty and abandoned. Trade networks that had connected the island to Egypt and Anatolia disappeared as piracy made sea travel impossibly dangerous. The literacy that had recorded palace business vanished with the scribes who had maintained it, beginning a dark age that would last for centuries. Ironworking knowledge arrived through refugee craftsmen who carried the secrets of the new technology in exchange for shelter and protection. Local smiths learned to forge tools and weapons from the hard metal that gradually replaced bronze in everyday use. Though the transition proceeded slowly due to limited access to raw materials, the Iron Age began through necessity rather than choice, as communities adapted to changed circumstances that made traditional bronze working impossible to maintain. Social organization evolved to meet challenges that palace administrators had never faced. Village elders who had once reported to Mycenaean officials found themselves governing autonomous communities that acknowledged no higher authority. Military leadership emerged from among men who could organize effective defense against raiders and bandits, while religious practices adapted to honor both ancient deities and new gods brought by various refugee populations. Dorian Greeks, fleeing chaos that had consumed their Peloponnesian homelands, established settlements throughout the island during the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse. These newcomers brought military traditions that emphasized disciplined formation fighting and intensive training from childhood. Yet they also proved willing to adapt their customs to local conditions. Intermarriage between Dorian families and indigenous populations created social bonds that transcended ethnic distinctions while preserving valuable elements from both cultural traditions. The warrior culture that developed during this period combined Dorian military organization with indigenous knowledge of local terrain and conditions. Young men learned to fight in the disciplined phalanx formations that had given Greek armies their advantages over less organized opponents. Yet they also mastered mountain warfare techniques that proved devastatingly effective in the island's rugged interior. These skills would later make them sought after as mercenaries throughout the Mediterranean world. Archery traditions achieved legendary excellence during the Dark Centuries, when communities faced constant threats from raiders and pirates. Composite bows, crafted from materials that included horn, wood, and sinew, delivered arrows with sufficient force to penetrate armor at ranges that kept shooters safe from retaliation. Young archers trained from childhood to achieve accuracy that could strike targets at distances impossible for ordinary bowmen, developing skills that would become synonymous with military effectiveness throughout the ancient world. Religious practices evolved to accommodate both indigenous traditions, honoring natural forces, and Greek anthropomorphic deities dwelling in distant Olympus. The Cave of Zeus on Mount Ida became a pilgrimage destination that attracted visitors from throughout the Mediterranean basin, combining ancient reverence for underground powers with newer mythological narratives about the King of Gods. Ceremonies conducted in this sacred space honored divine authority while acknowledging older forces that continued to influence agricultural abundance and seasonal transitions. Settlement patterns shifted as communities abandoned exposed coastal locations in favor of defensible positions that offered protection from seaborne raiders. Hilltop sites that commanded strategic valleys attracted populations seeking security, while mountain villages expanded to accommodate refugees from destroyed lowland settlements. These demographic changes created new social dynamics, as diverse populations learned to cooperate despite different cultural backgrounds and linguistic traditions. Pottery styles that developed during the transitional centuries reflected the fusion of influences characterizing this era. Geometric patterns replaced the naturalistic marine motifs of Minoan art, yet technical excellence maintained standards that impressed foreign traders when commercial contact gradually resumed. The distinctive vessels produced during this period have been discovered throughout the Mediterranean basin, demonstrating that local craftsmen had successfully adapted their skills to changing artistic preferences while maintaining quality that commanded international respect. Recovery began slowly during the 8th century BC as political stability enabled communities to invest in long-term projects beyond mere survival. Population growth allowed specialization that had been impossible when everyone's labor was needed for basic subsistence, while improved security encouraged merchants to risk ventures requiring travel beyond immediate neighborhoods. The prosperity that gradually returned enabled ambitious construction projects and artistic achievements that built upon surviving traditions while incorporating innovations learned through contact with other Greek communities. City-states emerged as the dominant form of political organization during this period of renewal. Knossos, rising from the ruins of its Bronze Age predecessor, attracted settlers through its strategic location and agricultural advantages, while memories of ancient glory inspired ambitious building programs. Gortyn developed into a major center through its control of fertile southern plains, while other communities like Litos and Kydonia established their own distinctive identities based on local resources and traditions. The legal revolution that produced the Great Law Code of Gortin represented the culmination of centuries of practical experience in governance without external authority. Carved into stone during the 5th century BC, this comprehensive legal document addressed property rights, family relationships, and criminal justice with sophistication that impressed observers throughout the Greek world. The 12 columns of text, visible to any citizen who could read, established principles that balanced individual rights with community needs while providing frameworks for resolving disputes through legal procedures rather than violence. These laws reflected social organization that had evolved to balance traditional aristocratic leadership with popular participation in ways that avoided both tyranny and chaos. Dual kingships, similar to Spartan institutions, provided executive authority, while councils of elders offered wisdom gained through experience. Popular assemblies enabled ordinary citizens to voice concerns about community affairs, while military service created bonds of mutual dependence that transcended social divisions based on wealth or family connections. Military institutions that developed during this period combined Greek tactical innovations with adaptations suited to local conditions. The hoplite phalanx, with its emphasis on disciplined formation fighting, required modifications when deployed on steep terrain, where maintaining alignment became impossible. Local commanders developed combined arms tactics that integrated heavy infantry with light troops trained in mountain warfare, creating flexible formations that proved devastatingly effective against enemies unfamiliar with the challenging landscape. Athletic contests during religious festivals offered a stage to showcase local wealth and gave young men a chance to prove skills useful in battle. These contests emphasized both individual excellence and team cooperation through events that tested archery, wrestling, and running abilities, alongside more traditional competitions inherited from earlier periods. Success brought glory not only to the individual, but also to their place of origin, paving the way for future roles as athletes or military leaders. Educational systems prepared young men for citizenship responsibilities while preserving knowledge essential to community survival. Boys learned reading and writing when these skills returned to the island, but practical training in agriculture, craftsmanship, and warfare received equal emphasis. Music and poetry, taught through memorization of traditional compositions, maintained cultural connections while developing artistic abilities that enhanced religious ceremonies and social gatherings. Mercenary service provided young warriors with opportunities to gain experience and wealth, while spreading the island's reputation for martial excellence throughout the ancient world. These soldiers, fighting in campaigns from Sicily to Asia Minor, earned respect for their discipline and skill, while bringing home knowledge of foreign tactics and equipment. Their service contracts often included provisions for returning home with sufficient resources to establish households and contribute to community defense, creating economic incentives that supported both individual advancement and collective security. With stability restored, traders were once again willing to journey far, rekindling the commercial networks that had gone quiet. The strategic position between Egypt and the northern Aegean made the island a natural stopping point for traders carrying goods between major commercial centers, while local products like olive oil, wine, and textiles found ready buyers throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Along with material wealth, these renewed ties offered a window into the intellectual currents shaping other Greek regions. Cultural synthesis occurred as intermarriage between indigenous families and Greek settlers created social bonds that transcended ethnic distinctions. Children growing up in these mixed households learned traditional crafts alongside Greek military training, while speaking languages that incorporated vocabulary from multiple sources. The resulting cultural fusion proved remarkably stable, creating shared identities that emphasized local loyalties rather than distant origins or ancestral homelands. Building ties with fellow Greek states demanded a delicate balance between asserting independence and embracing shared heritage. Agreements were struck by ambassadors journeying between islands and the mainland, designed to bring mutual gain without sacrificing autonomy. Their success in maintaining neutrality during major conflicts like the Persian Wars demonstrated sophisticated understanding of international politics and the advantages of strategic non-alignment. The Persian threat that dominated Greek politics during the early 5th century BC affected the island primarily through its impact on trade routes and alliance systems, rather than direct military intervention. Local rulers maintained careful neutrality that avoided provoking Persian retaliation while preserving relationships with mainland Greeks who led the resistance. This careful diplomacy allowed prosperity to endure, even as others were torn apart by war, reflecting hard-earned wisdom from generations of self-reliance. These celebrations, devoted to both Greek and local deities, helped maintain a sense of shared identity while honoring the seasonal changes essential to agriculture. The Curetes, young men who performed ritual dances commemorating Zeus's birth, combined Greek mythological narratives with local customs, emphasizing fertility and protection from supernatural threats. These ceremonies attracted visitors from distant islands while reinforcing community identity through shared participation in traditional activities. By the time Philip II of Macedon began his campaigns to unite the Greek world under northern leadership, the island had successfully transformed itself from the ruins of Bronze Age palace culture into a collection of prosperous city-states that maintained their independence through military excellence and diplomatic skill. Those who had outlasted the fall of Minoan grandeur, endured Mycenaean rule, and survived the turmoil of the Dark Ages, forged new systems that held onto core traditions while adjusting to new realities. The legal codes carved in stone at Gortin, the martial traditions that produced legendary archers, and the religious practices that honored both ancient and modern deities represented achievements that built upon centuries of practical experience in self-governance. But greater forces were gathering in the northern kingdoms, poised to challenge whether these hard-earned achievements could endure in a world shifting toward powerful territorial monarchies. Alexander's death in a Babylon palace sent shockwaves across his vast empire, as generals who had conquered the known world turned their swords against each other. From Spain to India, the territories that had bowed before Macedonian phalanxes erupted in civil wars that would rage for decades. Yet on the island between Egypt and Greece, the city-states that had preserved their independence through Persian invasions and Peloponnesian conflicts watched these distant struggles with calculating eyes, recognizing opportunity in the chaos consuming their would-be masters. The Diadochi, Alexander's successors, carved up his empire with bronze and blood, establishing kingdoms that stretched across continents while maintaining precarious control through constant warfare. Ptolemy seized Egypt and its fabulous wealth. Seleucus claimed the vast Asian territories, while Antigonus attempted to recreate Alexander's universal monarchy from his base in Macedonia. Each sought allies and resources to fuel their ambitions, yet none could spare the forces necessary to subdue an island whose rugged terrain and martial reputation promised costly campaigns with uncertain outcomes. This strategic situation transformed the formerly peaceful communities into something unprecedented in Mediterranean politics, a confederation of pirate states that would terrorize commerce for 2 centuries. The same naval skills that had once carried Minoan merchants to distant shores now served captains who preyed upon vessels carrying grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, and exotic goods from India. The absence of effective naval opposition allowed these raiders to establish bases throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while accumulating wealth that rivaled the treasuries of legitimate kingdoms. Piracy became the island's primary industry, as entire communities organized their lives around maritime predation. Coastal settlements that had once welcomed honest traders transformed into fortified harbors, where captured vessels were stripped of their cargoes before being sold in markets that asked no questions about provenance. Mountain villages provided secure bases where raiders could retreat when pursuit became too dangerous, while the profits from successful ventures funded expansion that enabled ever more ambitious operations. The economic model that sustained this maritime empire operated with brutal efficiency. Captured ships yielded not only their cargoes, but also their crews, who were sold in slave markets that supplied labor for mines, plantations, and households throughout the ancient world. Ransoms for wealthy passengers provided additional income, while vessels deemed suitable for raiding joined fleets that grew larger and more formidable with each successful venture. The profits generated by these activities exceeded anything legitimate commerce could have produced, creating incentives that made peaceful alternatives economically impossible. To meet these aggressive goals, political structures shifted in ways that pushed against traditional notions of legitimate governance. City-states that had once competed for glory in athletic contests now coordinated their activities to maximize plunder while minimizing conflicts that might weaken their collective strength. Captains who demonstrated exceptional skill in locating and capturing prey rose to positions of authority within confederations that operated according to principles recognizable to any modern criminal organization. The scope of these operations eventually extended throughout the Mediterranean basin as success bred ambition, and ambition demanded expanded territories. Raiders based in harbors like Kydonia and Hierapitna struck targets from Sicily to Syria while maintaining communications networks that provided intelligence about merchant movements and naval patrols. Their fleets, numbering in the hundreds by the 1st century BC, constituted a naval force that rivaled the legitimate navies of established kingdoms. Ties with different Hellenistic monarchs revealed the intricate political landscape shaped by this seafaring empire. Kings who publicly condemned piracy privately negotiated agreements that protected their own shipping while directing predatory activities against their enemies. The Ptolemies of Egypt, dependent on grain imports that fed Alexandria's massive population, paid tribute disguised as subsidies to ensure safe passage for their vital supply convoys. Even Rome, gradually extending its influence eastward, found accommodation more practical than confrontation when dealing with forces that could strangle Mediterranean commerce. Internal conflicts periodically weakened the Confederation, as rival captains struggled for dominance over the most profitable territories and routes. These civil wars, fought with the same ferocity that characterized external operations, sometimes provided opportunities for victims to achieve temporary respite from predatory attacks. Yet the underlying economic incentives that sustained piracy ensured that peace never lasted long, as successful leaders inevitably attracted followers eager to share in the wealth generated by maritime robbery. Years of relentless fighting led to military tactics that gave the raiders an edge over even the most established naval forces. Light, fast vessels optimized for pursuit and capture proved superior to the heavy warships designed for formal naval battles between established powers. Ramming tactics that had dominated Mediterranean warfare since the Bronze Age became obsolete when confronted by swarms of agile attackers whose speed and maneuverability enabled them to avoid decisive engagements while striking at vulnerable supply lines. During this time, cultural expression took forms shaped by the harsh realities of a society built on raiding and conquest. Traditional values emphasizing honor, hospitality, and respect for legitimate authority gave way to codes that celebrated cunning, ruthlessness, and contempt for victims whose weakness made them natural prey. Religious practices adapted to honor deities associated with warfare and fortune, while festivals celebrated successful raids rather than agricultural abundance or artistic achievement. The wealth accumulated through 2 centuries of systematic piracy transformed the physical landscape as prosperity enabled construction projects that rivaled the achievements of legitimate kingdoms. Fortified harbors bristled with defensive installations designed to protect accumulated treasures from both external enemies and internal rivals. Public buildings funded by plunder demonstrated prosperity that impressed foreign visitors while serving practical needs for storing and distributing the vast quantities of goods flowing through captured markets. Learning systems shifted to support the unique skills required in a world driven by maritime raiding. Young men learned navigation, seamanship, and combat skills that would enable them to join raiding expeditions, while instruction in languages and customs of potential victims provided intelligence advantages that increased operational effectiveness. Traditional academic subjects received less emphasis as practical knowledge became more valuable than literary or philosophical accomplishments. Social stratification reflected the distribution of wealth generated by successful piracy, as captains who led profitable ventures accumulated resources that enabled them to fund larger operations, while ordinary crew members remained dependent on their leaders' continued success. This concentration of economic power created political hierarchies that resembled feudal arrangements, with powerful families controlling fleets and territories through networks of personal loyalty and mutual obligation. The religious sanctuary at the Cave of Zeus maintained its international reputation, despite the island's transformation into a pirate confederation. Pilgrims continued arriving from throughout the Mediterranean world to honor the King of Gods, while festival competitions attracted athletes and artists who competed for prizes funded by maritime plunder. This curious combination of sacred tradition and criminal enterprise demonstrated the complex cultural adaptations that enabled ancient societies to reconcile conflicting values and practices. Trade relationships with legitimate merchants created paradoxical situations where the same communities that organized predatory expeditions also welcomed honest commerce that provided goods unavailable through piracy alone. Markets that dealt in captured cargoes operated alongside establishments that conducted conventional business according to traditional commercial practices. These dual economies enabled the island's inhabitants to maintain connections with the broader Mediterranean world, while pursuing activities that made them enemies of established order. Shifting political landscapes led to the rise and fall of military alliances, as ties with different Hellenistic powers moved between collaboration and confrontation. Egyptian fleets sometimes coordinated with local captains against common enemies, while Syrian kings hired raiders to harass their rivals' shipping. These temporary partnerships enabled small-scale operations to achieve strategic effects normally beyond their capabilities, while providing access to intelligence and resources that enhanced operational effectiveness. The Roman conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean gradually created conditions that made continued piracy unsustainable, as the Republic's growing naval power eliminated the political fragmentation that had enabled maritime predation to flourish. Pompey's campaigns against pirates in Cilicia and other regions demonstrated Roman determination to eliminate threats to commerce that fed the capital's enormous population. The systematic approach that characterized these operations, combining military force with economic incentives for peaceful surrender, proved devastatingly effective against enemies whose strength depended on political chaos. Quintus Caecilius Metellus received his command against the island's pirate confederation in 69 BC, with explicit instructions to end 2 centuries of maritime terrorism through whatever means proved necessary. His 3 legions, veteran troops who had fought in campaigns from Gaul to Asia, faced enemies who enjoyed advantages of terrain, local knowledge, and desperate determination to preserve their way of life. The war that followed would demonstrate both Roman military superiority and the fierce resistance that characterized populations fighting for their survival. The siege of Litos revealed the tactical challenges confronting Roman forces in mountainous terrain, where traditional legionary formations became vulnerable to guerrilla attacks. Metellus adapted his strategy to emphasize engineering works that gradually isolated defended positions, while avoiding costly frontal assaults against prepared fortifications. His systematic approach, building roads and supply bases that enabled sustained operations, slowly strangled resistance through methods that maximized Roman advantages while minimizing casualties. Individual communities that recognized the futility of continued resistance negotiated surrender terms that preserved their populations while acknowledging Roman authority. These agreements, offering citizenship and economic opportunities in exchange for cooperation, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how political incentives could achieve results that military force alone might not accomplish. The combination of overwhelming strength with reasonable terms for submission proved effective in convincing pragmatic leaders that accommodation offered better prospects than continued defiance. The final capture of Knossos ended organized resistance to Roman authority while eliminating the last major center of piratical activity. Metellus's triumph, celebrated with ceremonies that displayed captured treasures and prominent prisoners, marked the end of an era that had seen maritime predation challenge the fundamental assumptions about legitimate government and economic organization. The wealth accumulated through 2 centuries of piracy-filled Roman treasuries, while providing resources for the reconstruction that would transform conquered territories into productive provinces. Provincial administration, established under Roman authority, combined military control with economic policies, designed to channel the island's martial energies toward constructive purposes. Veterans of the pirate wars received land grants that enabled them to establish peaceful livelihoods, while their knowledge of local conditions proved valuable in governing populations that might otherwise have remained hostile to foreign rule. The gradual transformation from predation to production demonstrated Roman skill in converting enemies into allies through policies that served mutual interests. Foundations laid through infrastructure during the early imperial period supported a prosperity that left the piratical past behind. Roads that connected previously isolated communities enabled efficient administration, while facilitating commerce that replaced maritime robbery as the primary source of wealth. Aqueducts that supplied reliable water to growing cities supported population growth that provided labor for construction projects and agricultural expansion. Even under Roman rule, earlier legal frameworks endured, valued by governors for their stability and the loyalty they inspired. The law code of Gortin remained in force for matters involving family relationships and property disputes, while Roman civil law governed commercial transactions and criminal cases. This legal pluralism enabled smooth transitions between different systems of authority, while preserving cultural traditions that maintained social stability. Cities such as Gortyn were transformed through urban expansion, rising to prominence on par with major centers throughout the empire. Theaters, amphitheaters, and bath complexes provided amenities that demonstrated Roman commitment to civilized life, while temples honored both traditional deities and imperial cults that connected local populations to broader imperial institutions. These public works projects created employment opportunities while establishing visible symbols of Roman power and prosperity. With the introduction of new techniques, farmers were able to go beyond standard crops and draw greater productivity from their fields. Olive cultivation, supported by improved processing methods and expanded markets, became a major source of export income that connected rural producers to Mediterranean-wide commercial networks. Wine production, benefiting from Roman expertise in viticulture and storage, developed varieties that commanded premium prices in distant markets. A process of cultural synthesis unfolded, with Roman norms interwoven into local life, creating provincial styles that stayed rooted in tradition but aligned with empire. Artistic production combined classical motifs with regional preferences, while educational systems taught Latin and Greek alongside local languages. Religious practices honored traditional deities within imperial frameworks that acknowledged Roman authority while maintaining spiritual connections to ancestral customs. The spread of Christianity during the later imperial period found receptive audiences among populations that had learned to adapt their beliefs to changing political circumstances. Early Christian communities, established according to traditions linking their foundation to the Apostle Paul's missionary activities, provided spiritual alternatives that emphasized personal salvation rather than civic obligations. These religious innovations appealed particularly to urban populations whose cosmopolitan outlook made them receptive to universal rather than purely local forms of devotion. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the empire reached levels of prosperity never seen before, thanks to stable administration and secure conditions that allowed both land and labor to flourish. The quality of life improved significantly, and grand public projects spoke to the collective wealth that underpinned them. The move from piracy to productivity stood as proof of Rome's success in fostering unity and development rather than simply extracting value. Thanks to consistent governance, long-term planning flourished, producing institutions and public works that held firm through moments of disruption. Local magistrates, trained in Roman administrative methods, but responsive to provincial needs, provided leadership that balanced imperial requirements with community interests. The successful integration of formerly hostile populations demonstrated the effectiveness of policies that offered genuine benefits in exchange for political loyalty. By the early 4th century AD, the island had completed its transformation from a confederation of pirate states into one of the empire's most prosperous and peaceful provinces. The wealth that once flowed from maritime predation now derived from legitimate commerce, agricultural production, and manufacturing that served markets throughout the Mediterranean basin. Yet this very success would soon face challenges from new forces that would test whether Roman institutions could adapt to changing conditions that threatened the stability of the entire imperial system. Constantine's conversion in 312 AD sent tremors through every corner of his vast empire. Yet nowhere did this transformation create more profound changes than on the island where Zeus had once been born in sacred caves. Ancient temples that had honored Olympian gods for 1,000 years stood empty as their priests fled or converted to the new faith spreading like wildfire through urban populations. The cave of Zeus on Mount Ida, once crowded with pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world, echoed only with the prayers of hermit monks who sought solitude in chambers where pagan oracles had once proclaimed divine will. Bishop Titus, whose name connected him to the Apostle Paul's legendary companion, established his episcopal seat at Gortyn among the ruins of Roman administrative buildings. His cathedral, built from stones stripped from Jupiter's temple, symbolized more than architectural recycling. It marked the complete reversal of spiritual authority that would reshape every aspect of life on the island. Where Roman governors had once balanced competing religious traditions, Christian bishops now wielded temporal power alongside their spiritual authority, answering only to distant Constantinople. The Emperor Theodosius I's edicts of the 390s closed the last pagan sanctuaries while transferring their vast endowments to newly established monasteries. Monks from Egypt and Syria arrived to found religious communities in mountain caves that had sheltered hermits since the dawn of Christianity, bringing with them manuscripts that preserved classical knowledge alongside scriptural texts. These monasteries became centers of learning, where scribes copied works of Plato and Aristotle while illuminating gospels and theological treatises. Byzantine administration transformed Gortyn into a provincial capital that rivaled Constantinople's lesser districts. The Praetorian Palace, rebuilt in magnificent style, housed governors who ruled territories extending from the Aegean Islands to Libya's coastal cities. These officials, appointed directly by the emperor, governed through bureaucratic methods that made Roman administration seem primitive by comparison. Tax collectors used sophisticated accounting systems to extract revenues that funded both local projects and imperial campaigns, while military commanders organized defensive forces capable of repelling the barbarian raids that increasingly threatened Mediterranean shipping. Justinian's reconquest of the Western Mediterranean in the 6th century brought new prosperity as the island's strategic position made it a crucial base for operations against Vandal Africa and Ostrogothic Italy. The emperor's fleets, assembled in harbors that had once sheltered pirate vessels, carried armies that would reclaim territories lost to barbarian kingdoms for more than a century. Naval arsenals, established during this period, employed thousands of craftsmen who built the dromons and fire ships that gave Byzantine forces their decisive advantages over enemy fleets. Earthquake devastation in 365 AD had already demonstrated the island's vulnerability to natural disasters, yet nothing prepared its inhabitants for the plague that arrived from Egypt in 541. The disease, spreading through trade routes that connected every major port, killed perhaps a third of the population while disrupting agricultural production and commercial activities. Survivors fled to mountain villages, where isolation provided some protection, leaving coastal cities half empty and major construction projects abandoned. Recovery from this catastrophe proceeded slowly, as reduced populations struggled to maintain infrastructure that had been designed for much larger communities. Monasteries became centers of continuity, preserving not only religious traditions, but also practical knowledge about agriculture, medicine, and craftsmanship that might otherwise have vanished. The monks who maintained these institutions often possessed the only literacy in regions where schools had closed and libraries had crumbled. Arab conquests in the 7th century transformed the eastern Mediterranean into a war zone where Byzantine and Islamic forces struggled for dominance over territories that controlled access to Europe, Asia, and Africa. The island's position made it a natural target for both Christian and Muslim fleets, yet its mountainous interior provided defensive advantages that prolonged resistance against any invader. Coastal raids became increasingly frequent as Arab navies based in Syria and Egypt sought to establish footholds that could support larger operations. The siege of Constantinople in 717 to 718 marked the high tide of early Arab expansion, yet its failure encouraged Islamic commanders to seek alternative routes into European territories. Naval expeditions from Alexandria and Damascus explored possibilities for establishing permanent bases in the central Mediterranean, while merchants and diplomats gathered intelligence about local conditions and defensive capabilities. These reconnaissance missions revealed vulnerabilities that would later be exploited when political circumstances favored more aggressive action. Abu Hafs Umar al-Baluti, an Andalusian exile whose family had fled Cordoba after failed resistance to Umayyad authority, assembled a fleet of 40 ships in the Egyptian port of Alexandria during 824. His followers, refugees from various Islamic territories, possessed nothing to lose and everything to gain from successful piracy or conquest. The expedition they launched represented desperation as much as ambition, yet their knowledge of Mediterranean waters and military techniques would prove devastatingly effective against defenders who had grown complacent during decades of relative peace. The landing near Kissamos took local garrisons by surprise, unready for an invasion they neither expected nor could repel. Abu Hafs Umar's warriors, hardened by campaigns in Spain against Christian forces, swept through the coastal defenses as residents fled to mountain refuges. Within weeks, the invaders held much of the northern shore, and their ships commanded waters that had been under imperial control for 5 centuries. Gortin's capture after a brief siege eliminated organized resistance to Arab rule, while providing the conquerors with administrative centers and storage facilities needed to establish permanent authority. The city's fall sent shockwaves through Constantinople, where Emperor Michael II realized that his empire had lost control of territories crucial to maintaining communications between European and Asian provinces. Diplomatic efforts to negotiate the invaders' withdrawal failed, when Abu Hafs Umar rejected offers that would have made him a wealthy man, in exchange for abandoning conquests that promised to make him a king. Chandax, rising on the ruins of ancient Heraklion, became the capital of the new emirate as Arab engineers built formidable defenses that would hold off imperial sieges for over a century. Its towering stone walls, crafted from materials drawn from nearby mountain quarries, enclosed harbors large enough to shelter hundreds of ships, whose crews launched raids across the eastern Mediterranean. Designed by experts versed in the latest siege warfare, the city's fortifications included features that rendered them nearly unbreakable by the military technology of the time. The Emirates administration blended Islamic law with local customs in ways that enabled efficient government while avoiding unnecessary conflicts with subject populations. Christian communities that submitted to Arab authority retained their churches and religious practices while paying special taxes that funded the new government's military and administrative expenses. Many inhabitants converted to Islam, whether from genuine conviction or practical considerations, creating a mixed population that complicated later Byzantine attempts to reclaim the territory through appeals to religious solidarity. Piracy organized from these secure bases terrorized Mediterranean commerce for generations as Arab captains, supported by the Emirates' resources, preyed upon shipping that carried goods between Constantinople and its Italian territories. These raiders, operating with official sanction and professional organization, proved far more dangerous than the freelance pirates that had plagued earlier centuries. Their success provided revenues that funded continued expansion, while demonstrating to potential allies that the new state possessed both the capability and determination to challenge Byzantine naval supremacy. Repeated expeditions during the 9th century were unable to retake the territory, which became increasingly secure as each failed assault left behind arms and strategic knowledge for the defenders. The Dromans that had once dominated eastern Mediterranean waters proved vulnerable to new tactics that combined Greek fire with ramming techniques perfected in countless engagements. These defeats cost the empire enormous resources while enhancing Arab prestige throughout the Islamic world. In 949, Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus launched the most ambitious campaign to retake the island, gathering a fleet composed of ships from across the empire's Italian and Aegean holdings. His admiral, Constantine Gongylus, commanded forces that numbered in the tens of thousands, while carrying siege equipment designed to breach the walls of Chandax. The expedition's failure, after months of fruitless campaigning, demonstrated that the emirate had developed defensive capabilities that exceeded anything available to its enemies. Nikephoros Phokas, the future emperor renowned for his triumphs over Islamic forces in Syria and Mesopotamia, was given command of the final imperial campaign in 960. His army, composed of veteran troops who had fought successfully against Arab armies in land campaigns, adapted their tactics to the unique challenges of island warfare. The siege engines and tactical innovations they employed reflected lessons learned from previous failures, while incorporating new techniques developed through recent campaigns. The siege of Chandax in 961 lasted 8 months as Byzantine forces systematically destroyed the city's outer defenses while constructing their own fortifications to prevent relief expeditions from reaching the garrison. Nikephoros Phokas employed Greek fire ships to destroy Arab vessels trapped in the harbor, while his engineers used mining techniques to breach walls that had resisted every previous assault. The psychological pressure of prolonged isolation, combined with dwindling supplies and mounting casualties, gradually weakened defender morale. Arab resistance finally crumbled when imperial forces broke through the main gate, using a combination of mining and direct assault, overwhelming the exhausted defenders. The slaughter that followed reflected a mix of religious fury and long-held resentment toward enemies who had raided imperial lands for over a century. Few Muslim residents survived the capture of the city, and the widespread destruction erased most signs of Islamic rule and architecture. Reconstruction under restored imperial rule moved slowly, as officials faced the challenge of repopulating areas left shattered by war and widespread displacement. New colonists, recruited from Anatolia and Constantinople, received land grants that encouraged immigration while establishing communities loyal to imperial authority. These settlers brought Orthodox Christianity and Greek culture to regions where Islamic influence had been eliminated through systematic persecution of surviving Muslim populations. The theme of Crete, established as a new administrative unit, received special privileges that reflected imperial recognition of the territory's strategic importance and administrative challenges. Military colonists, granted hereditary holdings in exchange for service obligations, provided reliable defense against future invasion attempts, while their families established communities that could maintain Greek culture in a region where population had been drastically reduced. These arrangements created social structures that proved remarkably durable despite subsequent political upheavals. Monastic foundations, established during the period of Reconstruction, became centers of spiritual renewal, while preserving cultural traditions that connected the island to broader Byzantine civilization. The monastery of Arkadi, built with imperial patronage in a mountain location that provided security against future invasions, attracted monks from throughout the Orthodox world, while accumulating manuscripts and sacred artifacts that made it a pilgrimage destination. These religious communities maintained schools and hospitals that served surrounding populations while defending Orthodox theology against both Islamic influences and Latin innovations. Commercial revival proceeded gradually as peace enabled merchants to resume trading activities that had been disrupted during the centuries of warfare. The island's agricultural potential, enhanced by irrigation techniques learned from Arab farmers, produced surpluses of olive oil and wine that found ready markets in Constantinople and Italian cities. Profits from trade helped finance further reconstruction and offered strong incentives for newcomers from across the empire to settle. The Great Schism of 1054 brought new difficulties for imperial administrators tasked with ruling populations increasingly shaped by Latin influence, introduced through growing trade with Italian cities. Venetian and Genoese merchants granted privileged access under formal treaties, established commercial enclaves that doubled as hubs of Catholic presence. While these foreign settlements boosted economic activity, they also sowed religious divisions that would later ease the path for Western conquest. Military threats from Norman Sicily during the 11th century forced imperial commanders to maintain expensive garrisons while constructing new fortifications that could resist siege techniques developed in Western Europe. Robert Guiscard's invasion of Byzantine territories in the Balkans demonstrated that Italian Normans possessed both the capability and ambition to challenge imperial authority throughout the Mediterranean. The island's strategic position made it a potential base for operations against either Constantinople or Norman territories, ensuring continued military importance regardless of which power controlled it. In the late 11th century, Alexios I Komnenos introduced reforms that revitalized imperial administration and incorporated Western military practices that had outperformed older strategies. The pronoia system, which granted land holdings in exchange for military service, attracted foreign mercenaries while providing resources needed to maintain adequate defensive forces. These innovations enabled the empire to survive challenges that might otherwise have proven fatal. Yet they also created dependencies on foreign assistance that would eventually compromise imperial independence. The Fourth Crusade's diversion to Constantinople in 1204 transformed the political landscape throughout the Byzantine world as Frankish knights carved up imperial territories among themselves and their Italian allies. Venice, which had financed and directed the expedition for its own commercial purposes, claimed the most valuable territories while establishing a colonial empire that would dominate eastern Mediterranean trade for centuries. The island, assigned to Venetian control as part of this partition, found itself subject to Western authority for the first time since the Roman conquests. Enrico Dandolo, the blind doge, whose political genius had engineered Constantinople's fall, recognized the strategic value of territories that commanded access routes between Europe and the Levant. His negotiations with Frankish leaders secured Venetian control over key islands and coastal cities, while avoiding the expense of governing territories that would require constant military intervention. The arrangements he established created the framework for a commercial empire that would generate enormous profits while requiring minimal administrative investment. 7 centuries of rule came to a close, an era that had seen the island's transformation from Roman territory into a pillar of Orthodox civilization. The Greek culture and Christian faith that had been established during this period would prove remarkably durable despite subsequent foreign conquests, providing foundations for resistance movements that would eventually restore independence. Yet the immediate future belonged to Venetian merchants whose commercial priorities would reshape every aspect of life, according to the requirements of an empire built on trade rather than territorial conquest. Enrico Dandolo's blind eyes saw more clearly than any sight-blessed general when he directed the Fourth Crusade's ships toward Constantinople's golden walls instead of Jerusalem's dusty gates. The ancient doge, whose political genius had transformed a commercial expedition into the most profitable conquest in history, understood that Venetian prosperity depended on controlling trade routes rather than liberating holy sepulchres. His negotiations with Frankish knights secured territories that would generate wealth for centuries, while avoiding the expense of governing lands that required constant military intervention. The Partition Treaty of 1204 granted the strategic island to one of the leading maritime republics, integrating it into a colonial empire aimed at controlling trade across the eastern Mediterranean. Boniface of Montferrat received the Kingdom of Thessalonica, while Baldwin of Flanders claimed the restored Latin Empire. Yet neither possessed territories as valuable as the islands and coastal cities that fell to Venice's share. These acquisitions created a commercial network extending from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, with key positions commanding every major shipping route that connected Europe to Asia. Marcos Sanudo, nephew of the Doge who had orchestrated this redistribution of Byzantine wealth, received ducal authority over territories that had resisted conquest for 8 centuries. His fleet, assembled from vessels that had carried crusaders to Constantinople, landed at Suda Bay in 1204 to claim possession of lands whose inhabitants had known only Greek rule since the Arab evacuation. The resistance he encountered came not from organized armies, but from mountainous terrain that challenged every tactical innovation developed in Western European warfare. Local populations retreated to fortified positions that exploited natural defensive advantages, while maintaining communication networks that enabled coordinated resistance across vast distances. These Byzantine loyalists, led by archons, whose families had governed during the imperial period, possessed intimate knowledge of geography that more than compensated for their disadvantages in weapons and tactical training. Their strategy emphasized avoiding decisive battles while inflicting casualties that would eventually exhaust invaders who lacked secure supply lines. Step by step, the conquest unfolded through methodical siege operations, marked by the assailants' persistence and the defenders' fierce resistance. Candia held out for months, succumbing only after starvation weakened the garrison and siege engines wore down its defenses. Similar operations at Rethymno and Chania required extensive resources while producing limited territorial gains. Yet these coastal strongholds provided bases for further expansion into interior regions. Feudal organization imposed by the conquerors divided the territory among Catholic nobles, whose holdings followed patterns established in the Latin kingdoms of the East. Each knight received estates proportional to his military contribution, while accepting obligations to provide armed service during emergencies. This system, transplanted from Western Europe without modification for local conditions, created tensions that would persist throughout the period of Latin rule, as indigenous populations resented both religious persecution and economic exploitation. Venetian administration centered on Candia, which became the capital of a domain that extended Adriatic influence into waters that had been Byzantine for centuries. The rector who governed this territory answered directly to the Doge, while commanding military forces adequate to suppress internal rebellion and resist external invasion. His palace, built from stones stripped from Byzantine monuments, symbolized the replacement of Orthodox Greek authority with Latin Catholic power that acknowledged no compromise with previous traditions. Religious conversion efforts undertaken by Latin clergy met stubborn resistance from populations whose Orthodox faith had survived Arab conquest and would not yield to Catholic pressure. Forced attendance at Latin masses generated resentment rather than genuine conversion, while confiscation of monastery properties eliminated institutions that had preserved Greek learning through centuries of foreign rule. These policies created underground networks of resistance that maintained Orthodox practices while awaiting opportunities to challenge Latin authority. The arrival of new settlers introduced farming innovations that disrupted long-standing economic relationships rooted in earlier eras. Sugar cultivation, using techniques learned from other Mediterranean colonies, required massive investments in irrigation and processing facilities, while employing slave labor imported from captured territories. The profits generated by this industry exceeded anything achieved through traditional olive and grain production. Yet the social costs included displacement of indigenous farmers who had worked the same lands for generations. The revolt of Alexios Kalergis in 1282 demonstrated both the persistence of Greek resistance and the vulnerability of Latin rule to coordinated opposition. This uprising, led by archons, whose families had governed during the imperial period, exploited resentment generated by religious persecution and economic exploitation, while appealing to memories of Byzantine independence. The rebels seized control of vast interior regions before Venetian forces could organize effective countermeasures, revealing weaknesses in colonial administration that had seemed secure for nearly a century. Kalergis proclaimed himself emperor in ceremonies that deliberately evoked Byzantine traditions, while rejecting Latin authority that had never gained popular acceptance. His supporters included both displaced nobles and common farmers, whose cooperation demonstrated the depth of opposition to foreign rule. The uprising attracted assistance from Constantinople, where Byzantine emperors in exile recognized opportunities to reclaim territories lost during the Fourth Crusade's devastating aftermath. Suppressing the revolt demanded military resources that placed heavy strain on the colonial regime and exposed the challenges of ruling a resistant population. The siege of mountain strongholds consumed months of effort, while producing casualties that depleted forces needed for defending coastal positions against external threats. Victory, when it finally came, was so costly that subsequent administrators adopted more conciliatory policies toward indigenous populations, whose cooperation proved essential for maintaining control. Marco II Sanudo, great-nephew of the original conqueror, inherited a duchy weakened by constant warfare, yet enriched by commercial opportunities that made continued investment worthwhile. His reign marked a transition toward accommodation with Greek traditions that reduced tensions while preserving essential Venetian interests. Marriage alliances between Latin nobles and Greek archon families created bonds that transcended religious differences while establishing precedents for cultural synthesis. Economic prosperity during the 14th century reflected both successful agricultural innovation and expanding commercial networks that connected the island to markets throughout the Mediterranean basin. Wine production, enhanced by techniques imported from Italian territories, created exports that commanded premium prices in northern European markets. The quality achieved by local vintners exceeded anything produced in competing regions, establishing reputations that persisted long after political circumstances had changed. The Cretan Renaissance emerged from this economic foundation as prosperity enabled patronage of artistic and intellectual achievements that combined Italian innovations with Greek traditions. Orthodox icon painters, trained in techniques preserved through Byzantine monasteries, incorporated perspective and naturalistic elements learned from Western masters, while maintaining spiritual content that satisfied local religious sensibilities. These artistic syntheses created distinctive styles that influenced development throughout the Orthodox world. Domenikos Theotokopoulos, later known as El Greco after his departure for Spain, received his early training in workshops that represented this cultural fusion at its most sophisticated. His early icons, painted before exposure to Italian masters, demonstrated technical excellence while expressing spiritual intensity that reflected Orthodox theological traditions. The artistic education he received in Candia provided foundations for innovations that would later revolutionize European painting, while maintaining connections to Byzantine aesthetic principles. Educational institutions established during this period served both Latin and Greek communities, while creating opportunities for intellectual exchange that enriched both traditions. The Academy of Nobles, founded to educate Catholic colonists, attracted Greek students whose participation facilitated cultural dialogue that transcended religious divisions. These schools produced scholars who mastered both Latin and Greek learning, while contributing to literary and philosophical developments that influenced broader European intellectual life. Commercial expansion during the 15th century made the island one of Venice's most valuable possessions, as sugar and wine exports generated revenues that exceeded the costs of colonial administration. Malmsey wine, produced from grapes cultivated in selected vineyard regions, became synonymous with luxury throughout Northern Europe, while commanding prices that made viticulture enormously profitable. The wealth accumulated through these exports funded construction projects and artistic patronage that made Candia rival lesser Italian cities in magnificence. Ottoman pressure grew steadily during the 16th century, as Turkish naval forces established strategic bases that endangered trade routes and tested the defenses of key island fortresses. The fall of Cyprus in 1571 marked the end of the last significant Eastern possession and highlighted the determination of the Eastern Empire to reclaim lands that had remained in Christian hands since the days of imperial rule. These setbacks persuaded colonial officials that only significant investment in fortifications could safeguard their most prized remaining possession. Michel San Micheli, the renowned military engineer whose fortifications had protected cities throughout the Venetian mainland, received commission to design defensive works that could resist Ottoman siege techniques while accommodating the latest developments in artillery warfare. His plans for Candia incorporated star fort principles that had revolutionized European military architecture, while adapting these innovations to local topographical conditions. The fortifications he designed would prove their effectiveness during the longest siege in recorded history. The massive walls that rose from San Michele's designs enclosed a city capable of withstanding prolonged isolation while maintaining communication with relief forces that might arrive by sea. These fortifications included underground magazines for storing ammunition and supplies, cisterns for collecting rainwater, and defensive positions designed to maximize the effectiveness of artillery while protecting gunners from enemy fire. The engineering innovations incorporated into these works influenced military architecture throughout Europe, while establishing standards that would be copied for centuries. Similar defensive upgrades at Rethymno and Chania formed a network of interlinked strongholds capable of withstanding coordinated assaults, while preserving the Adriatic power's grip on key harbors. These coastal fortifications, joined by signal systems that allowed for swift communication, served as bases for naval operations that disrupted enemy shipping and safeguarded supply convoys from the western capital. Though the cost of construction was immense, the investment proved vital when invasion finally came. By the early 17th century, naval forces operating out of Constantinople and Alexandria posed a rising threat in the eastern Mediterranean, steadily gaining the skill and strength to challenge the maritime republic's control at sea. The 1571 Battle of Lepanto had checked their momentum, showing that disciplined strategy and advanced weaponry could win the day. Still, the broader trend favored their resurgence, as their superior resources allowed them to rebuild fleets faster than their Western opponents could sustain their own. Diplomatic tensions deepened in the 1630s, as Ottoman officials pressed for tribute that implied recognition of Turkish sovereignty. while administrators from the Adriatic Republic stood firm on defending an independence maintained for 4 centuries. These negotiations revealed fundamental incompatibilities between Islamic concepts of territorial authority and Christian traditions of autonomous governance. The failure of diplomatic solutions made military confrontation inevitable, despite the enormous costs that such warfare would impose on both sides. The invasion of 1645 opened with landings near Chania that caught defenders from the Adriatic Republic off guard, as assault operations unfolded on a scale and with a level of coordination previously unseen. Yusuf Pasha, leading tens of thousands of troops, quickly secured beachheads and directed engineers to begin siege works aimed at systematically dismantling the western stronghold. With remarkable speed and accuracy, the offensive revealed an advanced military force that outpaced the assumptions held by commanders of the maritime regime. Chania's siege revealed both the effectiveness of San Michele's fortifications and the determination of Ottoman forces to complete their conquest regardless of casualties. Turkish mining operations, conducted by engineers trained in the latest siege techniques, gradually undermined defensive positions, while the Maritime Republic countermines attempted to destroy enemy tunnels before they could reach their targets. This underground warfare continued for months, while artillery bombardments reduced ancient walls to rubble that defenders struggled to repair faster than enemy guns could destroy. With the fortress taken after a prolonged siege, the western coastline slipped from the hands of its defenders, giving the invading side vital harbors for continued troop landings and supply routes. Rethymno fell within weeks as demoralized defenders recognized the futility of resistance against enemies who possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers, equipment, and tactical expertise. These rapid victories provided Ottoman commanders with bases for advancing toward Candia, where the final phase of conquest would be decided. In taking command of Candia, Francesco Morosini understood he was safeguarding the final vestige of his homeland's power in the eastern reaches of the Mediterranean. His strategy emphasized maximizing the advantages provided by San Michele's fortifications, while organizing civilian populations to support military operations that would require every available resource. The preparations he ordered transformed the city into a fortress capable of prolonged resistance, even when completely isolated from external assistance. Beginning in 1648, the siege lasted 21 years, during which the besiegers steadily wore down the city's perimeter, while defenders responded by constructing new fortifications to replace those destroyed. This unprecedented duration reflected both the strength of defensive works and the determination of both sides to achieve decisive results regardless of costs. The siege became a symbol of Christian resistance to Ottoman expansion, while demonstrating the limits of Turkish military capabilities when confronted with properly prepared defensive positions. International volunteers arrived from throughout Catholic Europe to participate in what many viewed as a crusade against Islamic expansion. French engineers, funded by Louis XIV's government, brought expertise in siege warfare, while papal subsidies enabled recruitment of mercenaries, whose service provided additional manpower for defensive operations. These foreign contributions transformed a colonial conflict into an international confrontation that engaged major European powers in Eastern Mediterranean affairs. Ottoman mining operations, conducted on unprecedented scales, gradually eliminated bastions that had been designed to resist conventional artillery bombardment. With strategies developed during earlier sieges, invading engineers cut long tunnels through solid stone, while countermining teams within the city struggled to detect and neutralize these threats before charges could detonate beneath defensive lines. The expertise demonstrated by both sides in this subterranean warfare exceeded anything previously attempted in European military history. The psychological pressures of prolonged siege tested both attackers and defenders, as casualties mounted while decisive victory remained elusive for either side. Ottoman forces, originally expecting rapid conquest similar to their successes at Chania and Rethymno, found themselves committed to operations that consumed enormous resources while producing limited territorial gains. Sustained by the promise of reinforcements that ultimately proved inadequate, the defenders resisted with a steadfastness and order that impressed contemporary observers. Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, appointed to complete a conquest that had frustrated his predecessors, brought fresh troops and innovative tactics that finally overwhelmed defenders whose numbers had been reduced by years of constant warfare. His massive artillery bombardments, using cannons larger than any previously employed in the siege, breached walls that had resisted every previous assault, while his assault troops exploited gaps created by this concentrated firepower. The final attack succeeded not through superior courage, but through overwhelming material advantages that exhausted Venetian defensive capabilities. The surrender negotiations of 1669 reflected mutual respect between opponents who had demonstrated exceptional military capabilities while suffering enormous casualties in pursuit of incompatible objectives. Morosini, recognizing that continued resistance would only increase suffering without changing the ultimate outcome, negotiated terms that preserved the lives of surviving defenders while acknowledging Ottoman sovereignty over territories that had been Venetian for 4.5 centuries. The evacuation that followed ended the longest siege in recorded history, while marking Venice's final withdrawal from eastern Mediterranean territories. 12,000 Venetians and Cretan Catholics departed on ships provided by the Turkish authorities as part of surrender agreements that demonstrated Ottoman willingness to honor commitments made to defeated enemies. These refugees, carrying whatever possessions they could transport, abandoned homes that their families had occupied for generations, while facing uncertain futures in territories that might not welcome colonial administrators whose usefulness had ended with their empire's collapse. Their departure completed a population transfer that eliminated Latin influence while restoring Greek Orthodox dominance over territories that had been divided by religious conflicts for centuries. The fall marked the end of 4 centuries, in which a powerful maritime republic had turned a provincial territory into a wealthy colony, supporting artistic and architectural feats unmatched in the region. The mighty walls that had delayed conquest by over 20 years would collapse through disrepair, and the grand residences of Latin lords would house new officials from the east. Yet the cultural legacy, born from a blending of worlds, would prove more resilient than the governments that built it, continuing to influence creative and intellectual life for generations. Sultan Mehmed IV received news of Candia's surrender while hunting in the forests outside Adrianople. Yet the victory that had consumed decades and countless lives brought less satisfaction than anticipated. The conquest had cost the imperial treasury enormous sums, while demonstrating that even successful campaigns against determined Christian defenders required resources that strained the empire's capacity. The island that now bore the crescent banner had been purchased with blood and gold that might have funded more profitable ventures in Hungary or Poland. Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, the Grand Vizier, whose persistence had finally achieved success where previous commanders had failed, understood that conquest represented only the beginning of challenges that would test imperial administrative capabilities. The territory he now governed contained inhabitants whose loyalty could not be assumed despite military defeat, while geographic isolation made supervision difficult and rebellion attractive to discontented subjects. His first priority involved establishing control mechanisms that would prevent the island from becoming a burden rather than an asset to the Sultan's power. The inhabitants that remained after Venetian evacuation presented complex challenges for administrators accustomed to governing territories where Islamic and Christian communities had coexisted for centuries. Local Orthodox believers, freed from Latin Catholic oppression, initially welcomed Turkish rule that promised religious tolerance while eliminating foreign domination. Yet their expectations of autonomy quickly clashed with imperial determination to integrate conquered lands into existing administrative structures that recognized no exceptions for local traditions. Conversions to Islam proceeded rapidly during the early decades of imperial rule as practical considerations overcame religious convictions for families seeking advantages in the new order. The devshirme system, which recruited Christian boys for service in the Janissary Corps, had been abolished before the conquest, yet opportunities for advancement through military or administrative careers still required adoption of the ruling faith. These pragmatic conversions created a segment of Cretan Turks whose Hellenic identity persisted beneath Islamic religious observance. Ioannis Kantakouzenos, descendant of Byzantine emperors whose family had survived 4 centuries of Latin rule, exemplified the choices facing Orthodox nobles under the new regime. His decision to convert while maintaining secret contacts with Orthodox clergy demonstrated the complexity of loyalties that characterized transition periods when political allegiances conflicted with religious convictions. Such compromises enabled survival while preserving networks that would later support resistance movements when circumstances became favorable. Agricultural reorganization under imperial administration replaced Venetian feudalism with the Timar system that granted revenue rights to Turkish officials in exchange for military service obligations. This transformation eliminated Catholic landowners while creating opportunities for indigenous farmers to improve their status through cooperation with new rulers. The changes disrupted traditional relationships, yet proved less oppressive than the colonial exploitation that had characterized Latin rule. Mountain communities in Sfakia and other remote regions maintained relative autonomy that reflected both imperial pragmatism and the costs of governing territories where geography favored defiance over submission. These villages, accessible only through difficult passes that channeled potential invasions into killing zones, possessed martial traditions that made conquest prohibitively expensive even for the Sultan's armies. The modus vivendi that developed between Turkish administrators and highland clans preserved local self-rule while acknowledging nominal imperial sovereignty. Through the millet system, Orthodox communities retained self-governance based on their own legal traditions, while contributing financially to religious and military structures of the ruling power. This arrangement, refined through centuries of experience in governing diverse populations, avoided the religious persecution that had characterized Venetian rule, while maintaining clear distinctions between ruling Muslims and subject Christians. The Orthodox hierarchy that emerged under Turkish protection proved more influential than it had been during the Latin period. The 17th and 18th centuries saw economic expansion, driven by state-backed development in lucrative areas, alongside entrepreneurial activity at the local level. Olive cultivation expanded dramatically as the Sultan's markets absorbed production surpluses, while winemaking adapted to serve Islamic populations that consumed fermented beverages despite religious prohibitions. These agricultural improvements generated wealth that supported demographic growth, while funding construction projects that enhanced both Christian and Muslim communities. while newly established schools mainly addressed the needs of Islamic communities. Orthodox learning persisted in monastic settings that maintained Hellenic traditions without formal backing. The madres that opened in Candia attracted students from throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while fostering scholarship that combined Islamic theology with philosophical traditions inherited from Byzantine academies. These intellectual developments created cultural syntheses that enriched both civilizations while maintaining clear boundaries between different religious communities. Orlov's revolt in 1770 demonstrated both the persistence of Hellenic aspirations for self-rule and the vulnerability of imperial authority to external interference coordinated with internal uprising. Count Alexei Orlov, commanding Russian naval forces in the Mediterranean, promised military support for revolt that would coincide with Catherine the Great's war against the Sultan's armies in the Balkans. The conspiracy that developed around this offer attracted participation from Orthodox leaders throughout the Aegean, while revealing weaknesses in Turkish defensive arrangements. Daskalogyanis, chieftain of Sfakia, whose family had governed the mountain region since Phoenician times, received Orlov's assurances of Russian assistance while organizing networks that could coordinate simultaneous uprisings across the island. His decision to rebel reflected calculations that weighed certain death against possible freedom for people who had never accepted foreign domination, despite centuries of submission to superior force. The tragic outcome of his trust in foreign promises would become legendary throughout the Hellenic world. The revolt that erupted in spring 1770 initially achieved remarkable success as Orthodox communities rose simultaneously in regions where Turkish garrisons were insufficient to suppress coordinated defiance. Sfakian warriors, joined by fighters from other mountain communities, seized control of vast interior regions, while Russian ships appeared off northern coasts to provide promised support. These early victories convinced participants that liberation might finally be achievable through external assistance combined with domestic determination. Russian withdrawal following diplomatic agreements with imperial negotiators abandoned local rebels to face Turkish vengeance without the foreign support that had encouraged their initial uprising. Orlov's fleet, recalled to serve imperial interests that had changed with military developments in other theaters, left behind communities whose revolt could not be sustained against concentrated retaliation. The betrayal that followed demonstrated the dangers of relying on foreign powers whose commitments might be abandoned when circumstances changed. Daskalogyanis surrendered himself to Turkish officials in exchange for guarantees that his followers would receive amnesty for their participation in the failed revolt. His sacrifice, motivated by determination to save his people from collective punishment, was honored by imperial officials who respected courage even in defeated enemies. Yet the torture and execution that followed his surrender violated agreements while creating a martyr whose memory would inspire future generations of freedom fighters. The flaying that preceded Daskalogyanis' death became legendary throughout the Orthodox world as an example of both Turkish cruelty and Greek heroism that transcended ordinary human limitations. His refusal to reveal the names of co-conspirators, and despite agony that exceeded normal endurance, demonstrated spiritual strength that convinced witnesses they observed sanctity rather than mere political resistance. The songs that commemorated his sacrifice spread throughout Greek communities, while inspiring commitment to independence that would outlast Ottoman power. Recovery from this catastrophic failure required decades as survivors rebuilt communities that had been devastated by Turkish reprisals, so while preserving memories of martyrdom that sustained hopes for eventual liberation. Secret schools operated in remote locations, where Orthodox clergy taught children to read texts in their ancestral language, while maintaining religious traditions that connected local communities to broader Hellenic identity. These educational efforts preserved cultural continuity while preparing new generations for future struggles. Napoleonic upheavals that transformed continental politics during the early 19th century created opportunities for revolutionaries who recognized that imperial weakness might enable successful movements for self-rule. The example of successful revolts in Serbia and other Balkan lands demonstrated that Turkish authority could be challenged effectively when coordinated action received external support from powers hostile to the Sultan's interests. These precedents encouraged planning for uprisings that might achieve permanent liberation rather than temporary autonomy. The War of Independence that erupted in the Peloponnese during 1821 inspired immediate sympathetic responses throughout Orthodox communities that had endured centuries of foreign domination. News of successful battles against Turkish armies convinced many that divine providence finally favored Christian liberation from Islamic rule. The island's strategic position made it crucial for maintaining communications between different theaters of revolt, while its naval traditions provided essential support for the freedom movement. Egyptian intervention under Ibrahim Pasha brought modern military forces trained in European methods to suppress Greek rebellion that had achieved alarming success through guerrilla tactics and foreign sympathy. Muhammad Ali's decision to assist the Sultan reflected calculations that successful participation in counter-revolutionary campaigns would be rewarded with territorial concessions and enhanced autonomy within the Ottoman system. The army he dispatched represented the most formidable threat Greek independence movements had yet confronted. Ibrahim's occupation from 1824 to 1840 imposed military administration that attempted to transform rebellious inhabitants into productive subjects through systematic application of modern governmental techniques. His infrastructure projects, including roads and harbors that facilitated communication and commerce, demonstrated benefits that cooperation with imperial authority could provide. Yet the harshness of military rule generated resentment that convinced many inhabitants that any form of the Sultan's sovereignty remained unacceptable. Forced labor conscription for public works projects displaced traditional agricultural activities, while providing employment that enabled survival during years when warfare had disrupted normal economic relationships. The corvée system that Ibrahim implemented resembled arrangements that had characterized earlier periods of intensive construction, yet its application under military supervision created conditions that many regarded as slavery, despite nominal compensation for services rendered. These experiences reinforced determination to achieve complete self-rule, rather than accepting reformed versions of foreign domination. Continental intervention in the 1840s reflected great power concerns that Egyptian autonomy threatened the balance of forces that maintained stability in the eastern Mediterranean. British and French pressure forced Muhammad Ali to withdraw his forces while restoring direct imperial administration that proved incapable of preventing continued defiance of Turkish authority. The power vacuum that resulted from these diplomatic maneuvers enabled local leaders to organize new forms of opposition that would eventually achieve liberation. Rising nationalism during the mid-19th century provided intellectual frameworks that connected local traditions of defiance to broader movements for national liberation that were transforming continental politics. The concept of ethnicity as the legitimate basis for political organization challenged imperial systems based on religious affiliation, while providing justification for revolt that transcended mere opposition to foreign rule. These ideological developments transformed traditional defiance into modern revolutionary movement. Secret societies that proliferated during this period coordinated activities while maintaining communications with freedom movements in other lands. The Philiki Etairea and similar organizations established networks that could synchronize uprisings while providing financial and military support for operations that required resources beyond local capabilities. These conspiracies attracted participation from Orthodox clergy, merchants, and intellectuals whose cooperation transcended traditional social boundaries. The Great Revolution that erupted in 1866 represented the culmination of decades of preparation, as organizers coordinated simultaneous uprisings throughout the island while appealing for international support from continental powers sympathetic to Christian liberation. The assembly of Apokoronas that proclaimed self-rule demonstrated organizational capabilities that exceeded anything achieved in previous revolts, while establishing governmental institutions that could administer liberated lands. The siege of Arkadi Monastery in November 1866 created the most powerful symbol of Greek resistance to Ottoman oppression, when Abbot Gabriel Marinakis chose martyrdom rather than surrender to Turkish forces that demanded access to revolutionaries who had taken refuge in the sacred precincts. His decision to ignite gunpowder stores that killed defenders and attackers alike demonstrated spiritual commitment that convinced European observers they witnessed sanctity rather than mere political resistance. 943 deaths in the monastery. Explosion shocked continental public opinion while generating sympathy for Hellenic freedom that translated into diplomatic pressure on imperial officials. The photographs that documented the massacre's aftermath, among the first war images to achieve international circulation, provided visual evidence of Turkish brutality that contradicted official claims about civilized governance of Christian communities. These images became propaganda tools that influenced foreign policy decisions throughout the continent. International intervention following the Arkadi massacre forced imperial officials to negotiate reforms that granted substantial autonomy while stopping short of complete self-rule that revolutionaries demanded. The Pact of Halepa in 1878 established an autonomous government that recognized the Sultan's sovereignty while enabling local administration according to Christian preferences. This compromise satisfied neither aspirations for freedom nor imperial determination to maintain control, ensuring continued conflict. Violations of Halepa, provisions by Turkish officials who refused to implement promised reforms, generated new revolts during the 1880s and 1890s, as the autonomous government proved incapable of protecting communities from administrative abuse. These renewed uprisings demonstrated that partial self-rule could not satisfy aspirations that demanded complete liberation from any form of imperial authority. The cycle of revolt and repression continued until external intervention finally resolved conflicts that local negotiations could not settle. The Thermopylae incident in 1897 brought continental naval intervention when Hellenic warships attempted to land supplies for rebels who controlled vast interior regions despite Turkish efforts to suppress their defiance. The international fleet that assembled to prevent military assistance to co-religionists reflected great power determination to maintain regional stability while avoiding confrontations that might trigger broader conflicts. These diplomatic interventions demonstrated that liberation could be achieved only through international agreement rather than military victory. Establishment of the autonomous state in 1898 under great power protection created unprecedented governmental arrangements that satisfied neither aspirations for union with the mainland nor imperial claims, while providing stability that enabled gradual transition toward complete self-rule. Prince George of Greece, appointed as High Commissioner by the protecting powers, governed lands that remained nominally under the Sultan while operating according to Hellenic preferences. This unique constitutional experiment demonstrated continental willingness to impose solutions that served broader strategic interests. Tensions between Prince George and local leaders pushing for faster unification with the mainland sparked political crises that jeopardized the stability meant to be ensured by international agreements. Eleftherios Venizelos, emerging as spokesman for these aspirations, organized opposition that challenged royal authority while maintaining loyalty to national objectives that transcended personal allegiances. His political skills would eventually transform him into one of the continent's most influential statesmen. The Theriso Revolution of 1905 represented Venizelos' successful challenge to princely authority that had failed to advance objectives while alienating communities whose sacrifices had earned them the right to determine their own political destiny. The provisional government he established demonstrated capabilities that convinced continental observers that local leadership possessed qualifications for complete self-governance that no longer required foreign supervision. This political maturation prepared the way for final achievement of freedom. Union with the mainland in 1913 fulfilled aspirations that had motivated centuries of struggle against foreign domination, while creating obligations to participate in broader national objectives that would soon involve the island in continental conflicts. The ceremony that formally transferred sovereignty demonstrated both the achievement of long-sought goals and the assumption of new responsibilities that connected local communities to international developments beyond their control. World War that erupted immediately after unification tested national unity, while revealing divisions between supporters of different foreign policies that reflected conflicting assessments of interests. Venizelos' support for the Entente powers contradicted King Constantine's preference for neutrality, creating constitutional crises that temporarily divided the nation, while the island's strategic position made it crucial for Allied operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so concluded over 2 centuries of imperial rule, an era that had protected Orthodox Christianity but suppressed nationalist aspirations until shifting international dynamics made independence possible. The long struggle for liberation had created traditions of defiance and self-governance that would influence modern political development, while demonstrating that determined communities could eventually overcome foreign domination, despite overwhelming disadvantages in resources and military capabilities. The island that had survived conquest by Romans, Arabs, and Crusaders had finally achieved the freedom that geography and culture had always promised, but politics had long denied. Eleftherios Venizelos stood on the harbour at Chania in October 1913, watching Hellenic flags replace the international banners that had flown over the island for 15 years. The ceremony that transferred sovereignty to the mainland kingdom fulfilled dreams that had sustained his people through centuries of foreign rule. Yet the veteran statesman understood that freedom brought responsibilities as complex as those imposed by conquest. The strategic position that had made his homeland valuable to Venetians and Turks would soon entangle it in continental conflicts where neutrality offered no protection. The Great War that erupted in 1914 divided the newly unified nation as King Constantine favored neutrality, while his prime minister advocated support for the Entente powers fighting Germany and Austria-Hungary. This constitutional crisis, known as the National Schism, temporarily split the kingdom between royalist forces controlling Athens and Venizelist revolutionaries governing northern territories. The island's population supported their liberators' pro-Allied policies, while its harbours provided bases for British and French naval operations. Naval activity intensified throughout 1915, as Allied fleets used Suda Bay to support the Gallipoli campaign that aimed to force the Dardanelles and eliminate Turkey from the war. Destroyers and cruisers crowded the anchorage, while hospital ships carried wounded soldiers from the killing fields of the peninsula to medical facilities hastily established in requisitioned buildings. The strategic importance demonstrated during these operations convinced British planners that the island must never fall under hostile control. Population exchange with Turkey in 1922 brought thousands of refugees whose ancestors had lived in Anatolia since Byzantine times. These newcomers, fleeing the catastrophe that had ended Hellenic presence in Asia Minor, carried only the possessions they could transport, while abandoning homes their families had occupied for generations. Their settlement in abandoned Muslim villages created new communities, while straining resources that had been adequate for pre-war populations. Economic modernization during the 1920s and 1930s transformed agricultural practices while connecting rural producers to international markets through improved transportation networks. The completion of roads linking major cities enabled truck transport that reduced dependence on coastal shipping, while electrification projects brought power to communities that had relied on primitive lighting systems. These improvements raised living standards while creating infrastructure that would prove crucial during the coming conflict. Ioannis Metaxas, the dictator who seized power in 1936, imposed authoritarian rule that suppressed political opposition while preparing the nation for war that he considered inevitable. His regime emphasized discipline and national unity through programs that combined fascist organizational methods with traditional values, emphasizing Orthodox Christianity and Hellenic identity. The fortifications he ordered constructed along the Albanian border would soon face their ultimate test against forces that had conquered most of continental Europe. Mussolini's invasion of Albania in April 1939 brought Axis forces to the kingdom's northern frontiers, while demonstrating that the Mediterranean had become a theatre of great power competition. Italian air bases in Albania threatened shipping routes that connected the homeland to its islands, while German U-boats operating from captured French ports interdicted convoys carrying essential supplies. The strategic situation that developed convinced British commanders that they must retain control of positions that dominated eastern Mediterranean sea lanes. The surprise attack on mainland territories in October 1940 caught defenders unprepared for assault operations, conducted with unprecedented scale and coordination. Mussolini's divisions, advancing from Albanian bases toward vital objectives, initially achieved rapid progress that threatened to collapse defensive lines before reserves could be mobilized. Yet the mountainous terrain that had protected earlier generations of freedom fighters channeled invaders into valleys where determined resistance could neutralize numerical advantages. Counteroffensives launched during the winter of 1940 to 1941 drove Italian forces back across the Albanian frontier while capturing territories that had never been under Hellenic control. These victories, achieved against enemies who possessed superior equipment and air support, demonstrated that courage and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantages when defenders fought on familiar ground. The success inspired Allied confidence while convincing Hitler that German intervention was necessary to secure his southern flank. Operation Marita, launched on April 6, 1941, brought Wehrmacht divisions into the Balkans with overwhelming force that eliminated organized resistance within 3 weeks. German mountain troops, supported by Stuka dive bombers and panzer units, advanced through Macedonia and Thrace, while paratroopers seized key positions that controlled vital transportation routes. The speed of this conquest exceeded even German expectations, while confirming that modern warfare required resources beyond the capacity of smaller nations to provide. Evacuation operations conducted by the Royal Navy saved thousands of Commonwealth soldiers who had been dispatched to support their ally, but arrived too late to affect the campaign's outcome. Destroyers and cruisers, operating under constant air attack, removed troops from beaches where they faced annihilation, while German artillery closed available escape routes. The vessels that reached Egyptian ports carried remnants of forces that would soon face an even more desperate battle. General Kurt Student, commanding the 11th Air Corps that had pioneered vertical envelopment tactics during campaigns in Norway and the Low Countries, received orders to plan Operation Mercury, the airborne conquest of territories that controlled approaches to the Suez Canal and eastern Mediterranean oil fields. His Fallschirmjäger, elite troops who had spearheaded previous victories, would attempt the largest paratrooper assault in military history while demonstrating capabilities that could revolutionize warfare. The objectives they were assigned included 3 airfields that could accommodate transport aircraft, carrying reinforcements and heavy equipment. Bernard Freyberg, the New Zealand general commanding Allied defenders on the island, possessed intelligence advantages that should have enabled decisive victory against enemies whose plans had been compromised through ultra-decrypts. His knowledge of Reich intentions, obtained through British code-breaking efforts, revealed landing zones, objectives, and timetables with accuracy that eliminated strategic surprise. Yet restrictions on how this information could be used, designed to protect intelligence sources, prevented optimal deployment of defensive resources. Preparations for the coming assault transformed the island into a fortress where every village became a strong point and every hill a potential battlefield. Commonwealth engineers destroyed airfields while laying minefields that would channel attackers into prepared killing zones. Local militias, armed with weapons captured from retreating Italian units, established ambush positions along roads where Nazi reinforcements might advance. These defensive measures created conditions favoring defenders while demonstrating determination to resist regardless of odds. The morning of May 20th, 1941, dawned clear and cloudless as hundreds of transport planes approached from airfields in mainland territories recently conquered by the Wehrmacht. Junkers Ju-52 trimotors, flying in formations that darkened the sky, carried paratroopers whose mission would determine whether Nazi Germany could project power across water barriers that had traditionally protected island positions. The sight of this aerial armada convinced observers they witnessed warfare's future, while creating terror among civilians who had never experienced large-scale combat. Malem Airfield became the focal point of struggles that would determine the campaign's outcome as Fallschirmjäger, scattered by defensive fire and navigational errors, attempted to seize facilities that could accommodate follow-up units. The New Zealand battalion, defending this vital position, fought with desperate courage, while Reich engineers worked under fire to clear obstacles that prevented planes from landing. Control of this single runway would determine whether Operation Mercury succeeded or failed catastrophically. Fighting throughout the first day exceeded Nazi expectations for casualties, while falling short of objectives that planners had considered achievable through surprise and superior tactics. Paratroopers who landed near their assigned targets faced immediate counterattacks by defenders who had been alerted to expect assault, while those who missed landing zones found themselves isolated in hostile territory where every civilian might be an enemy. The elite troops who had conquered Norway and captured strategic bridges in Holland discovered that vertical envelopment required more than courage when defenders were prepared. Local inhabitants joined the battle with weapons ranging from hunting rifles to agricultural tools, transforming a combat situation into a popular uprising that challenged fundamental assumptions about civilian behavior during modern warfare. Farmers who had tended olive groves for generations became guerrilla fighters who ambushed isolated paratroopers, while women and children provided intelligence about enemy movements. This civilian participation violated international law, while demonstrating that occupation could not be achieved simply by defeating organized armies. The decision to abandon Malem airfield on the evening of May 20th created opportunities that Wehrmacht commanders exploited with tactical brilliance that overcame earlier setbacks. Transport planes, landing despite continued defensive fire, disgorged mountain troops whose arrival shifted the balance while providing heavy weapons that paratroopers had been unable to carry. The reinforcement of Nazi positions around the captured airfield enabled expansion of attacks that gradually overwhelmed defensive lines. Counterattacks launched on May 21st and 22nd failed to recapture Malem, despite desperate efforts that came within meters of success, before superior Reich firepower halted advancing Commonwealth units. The failure of these assaults, conducted without adequate artillery support or air cover, convinced Allied leaders that continued resistance would only increase casualties without changing the ultimate outcome. Yet the decision to evacuate contradicted local expectations that the battle would continue regardless of costs. Students' tactical victory came at prices that eliminated airborne campaigns as a strategic option for future Nazi endeavors. Casualties among Fallschirmjäger units exceeded 50%, while transport plane losses reduced the Luftwaffe's capacity for supporting missions requiring specialized equipment. The Pyrrhic nature of this success convinced Hitler that vertical envelopment tactics were too expensive for regular employment, ironically protecting Allied positions in Malta and Gibraltar from similar assaults. Evacuation missions conducted during the final days of May demonstrated both Royal Navy determination to preserve trained soldiers and the costs of maintaining maritime supremacy against modern air power. Destroyers and cruisers approaching southern beaches under cover of darkness embarked troops while enemy aircraft attacked with bombs and torpedoes that sank several vessels. The ships that reached Alexandria carried survivors whose experience would prove valuable in later campaigns. Yet their departure marked another British retreat from territories that geography should have made defensible. Occupation policies imposed by Wehrmacht administrators reflected lessons learned during previous campaigns, while adapting to conditions that differed significantly from those encountered in Western Europe. The civilian participation that had characterized the battle's first days convinced leaders that harsh measures were necessary to prevent continued resistance, while geographic isolation made traditional occupation techniques inadequate for maintaining control. The reprisals that followed violated international law, while creating martyrs whose memory would inspire continued opposition. Comeno massacre on August 16th, 1943, demonstrated the brutality that characterized anti-partisan operations, as German mountain troops executed 317 civilians suspected of supporting resistance activities. Similar atrocities occurred throughout occupied territories, as military commanders attempted to eliminate support networks that enabled guerrilla operations to continue despite overwhelming odds. These war crimes, documented by survivors and Allied intelligence services, would eventually result in prosecution of responsible officers. Resistance movements that emerged during the occupation combined traditional banditry with modern guerrilla warfare while maintaining communications with Allied special operations forces operating from Middle Eastern bases. Capitan Banduvas, whose followers controlled mountainous regions where German patrols ventured only in company strength, organized attacks on transportation infrastructure while protecting civilians who cooperated with liberation efforts. His success demonstrated that determined fighters could maintain opposition despite technological disadvantages. British Special Operations executive agents parachuted into remote regions where local guides could provide security, coordinated resistance activities while training guerrilla fighters in sabotage techniques that maximized damage while minimizing casualties. Major Patrick Lee Firmer, whose classical education enabled communication with intellectuals who led resistance networks, organized operations that achieved strategic effects despite limited resources. His most famous success involved kidnapping General Heinrich Kreiper, the divisional commander responsible for occupation policies. The kidnapping operation, conducted in April 1944, demonstrated both the vulnerability of German commanders and the sophistication of resistance networks that could coordinate complex operations while evading massive search efforts. Firmer and his Hellenic accomplices, disguised as German military police, stopped Kreiper's vehicle outside Heraklion before spiriting him across the island to a beach where submarine evacuation was arranged. The psychological impact of this success exceeded its tactical significance while providing propaganda victories that sustained morale throughout occupied Europe. Reprisals following the kidnapping included the destruction of villages suspected of supporting resistance activities, while mass arrests eliminated actual and potential supporters of anti-German operations. The collective punishment imposed on innocent populations reflected occupation policies that held entire communities responsible for actions by individual resistance fighters. These measures succeeded in reducing guerrilla activities while creating hatred that would influence post-war relationships between former enemies. Economic exploitation during the occupation extracted agricultural products and strategic materials needed for the German war effort, while reducing local populations to subsistence levels that caused widespread malnutrition. Requisitions of olive oil, wine, and livestock depleted resources that had sustained communities for generations, while currency manipulation eliminated savings that families had accumulated through decades of labor. The impoverishment that resulted created conditions favoring resistance while demonstrating the costs of military occupation. Liberation arrived in October 1945 as German forces, isolated by Allied naval supremacy and threatened by Soviet advances in the Balkans, evacuated territories they could no longer defend effectively. The departure of occupation forces ended 4 years of brutal rule, while beginning a new chapter in which local populations would determine their own destiny. Yet the scars left by warfare and repression would influence political development for generations, while the island's strategic importance ensured continued involvement in international conflicts. British forces that replaced German occupiers discovered populations traumatized by experiences that had tested human endurance, while revealing both heroism and collaboration that characterized life under military occupation. The civil conflicts that erupted between resistance groups with different political objectives demonstrated that liberation did not automatically restore social harmony. The island that had resisted conquest by one of history's most formidable military machines now faced the challenge of rebuilding communities shattered by total war. With this, the island emerged from its most desperate trial in a history built on enduring resistance to foreign power. From Minoan sea kings to Nazi paratroopers, conquerors had discovered that some territories could be occupied but never truly subdued. The courage displayed during 25 days in May 1941 had confirmed lessons taught by earlier generations who had chosen death over submission, while demonstrating that freedom required constant vigilance and willingness to sacrifice everything in its defense. The island that would not fall had once again proven that geography and spirit combined could defeat even the most advanced military technology when defenders fought for their homeland's survival.